Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we gather to cohere in dialogue at the knife's edge of what matters most. I'm Raven, and I'll be your host for the evening. Today we are doing our kickoff of an event that will be recurring into the future with Samo Burja called Live Players. Samo is a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation and the founder of Bismarck Analysis. He's a writer and speaker, and he's known for his work on intellectual dark matter and great founder theory, and much more. So the way that this event's going to go is we'll have 20 minutes of a talk with Samo, and then we'll move into the Q&A. If you have a question for Samo, you can go ahead and type it into the chat, and then I will MC the Q&A period. And with that, I give you Samo.
Thank you for the introduction, Raven. Pleasure to be back here. I've done previously a talk on great founder theory, and I look forward to discussing live players with everyone today. This is a start of something of a series because it's not just a theoretical concept, right? Live players are people who in fact are still shaping our world. So there's always something to talk about in this regard, and there are many subtle ways in which adaptive individuals shape the world. Let's first think of some people who, might be good examples of live players. One of my favorite examples is Elon Musk. He was recently in the news this Wednesday. He's an example of someone who took two completely failing industries in a way, aerospace and car manufacturing, and actually pushed them forward into something relatively new or even completely new. This was just basically something that wasn't supposed to happen, wasn't going to happen. And in fact, almost every bureaucratic institution stood in his way, right? Including his nominal clients at, say, NASA, let alone his competitors at Boeing, and later on, possibly competitors who are as live as he is, such as Bezos. Most people in the world operate off of scripts. They operate off of what has worked before, or what they've observed and been socialized works for other people. Because of that, it's best to model human behavior as exploring these different ecological niches, right? So a bird doesn't know how to fly. It knows how to fly, but it doesn't know how the aerodynamics works. And a bird certainly couldn't design another bird. And a bird certainly can't really learn how to swim. It might, through many, dozens of generations, hundreds of generations, millions of generations, evolve into a duck or a penguin or something like this. But it's never going to do this valley crossing on its own in a single lifetime. This is precisely what live players do. When I analyze, basically these exceptional individuals, we always look for the signs of someone mastering more than one domain, especially if this domain is completely disconnected from previous domains, right? Something that where someone that historically might have shown, a strong predisposition towards intelligence work ends up also being a good general, or someone that had previously run entrepreneurial ventures suddenly turns out to be an exceptional artist in their own right, or someone that was once an exceptional artist ends up being a politician. An interesting example here is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who might seem like a very trivial example, but consider how many people would, in the course of their life, be an missing soldier who doesn't show up to the right appointment because they're doing a bodybuilder competition, and then manages to talk themselves out of a disciplinary inquiry by arguing that him winning the bodybuilding competition is good PR for his military unit. He did that in Austria. That's how he got his start. And after that, would pivot this into appearing in a documentary, but then wouldn't stop there, would be an actor. Now, of course, once he became an actor, people constantly kept saying he's not really an actor, he's just a mountain of muscle, he just appears on screen. Now, when he ran to be governor of California, that's when they started calling him an actor, right? Then to dismiss him as a politician, you couldn't really dismiss him as a bodybuilder. You'd have to dismiss him as an actor. In each of these cases, there was like some transfer of skill, obviously, right? Like physical and so on. And there was always this thread of charisma and persuasiveness that he had. But very importantly, he was able to reinvent himself over and over and over again. And I'm quite sure were the constitution of the US slightly different, he'd probably be president today. Being foreign born, being Austrian born, he never could run. Someone like Howard Hughes was once very similar, right? He's the less well-known industrialist predecessor to Elon Musk, arguably maybe inspired Elon Musk or whatever. He was active in the 30s and 40s, both in aerospace and in the movie industry, right? Both of them at the time, high-tech frontiers. A different example, perhaps one that's more infamous, more negative of a live player, would I think be Vladimir Putin, right? He starts off as a KGB agent, becomes an assistant to a mayor, becomes an assistant to a president, becomes president, stays president or prime minister for 20 to 30 years while competing with some of the most ruthless oligarchs, organized crime leaders, and yes, other KGB agents for power in the Russian state. And Russia today, for whatever you might think of it, punches way above its weight in terms of its political significance. This is a country that has 100 to 30 million people right now, that has a vast nuclear arsenal, but a GDP that's like smaller than Italy's. This is a country that is outspent by the US by an order of 20, possibly 30, depending on how you count. It still wins the proxy civil war that the US and Russians were fighting in Syria, right? The US government, or at least part of the US government, trying to topple Assad, the Russians trying to support Assad. Of course, the normal way we hear about this, the way it's talked, is that, the revolution in Syria failed. Well, who made the revolution in Syria happen? I'm sure there are many people in Syria that have deep grievances with Assad, and I'm sure there are many people in Syria who would have even deeper grievances with ISIS, who's the main opposition to Assad, right? The foreign support, be it the aircraft, the anti-aircraft weapons, the money, the intelligence agents, the special forces, and various military units, such as Russia's Wagner Group, or on the US side, the equivalent of Blackwater, right? So these private military corporations that have former veterans, former soldiers acting in a private capacity, but often still at the behest of foreign leaders. These resources are the ones that start or end a civil war in reality, right? It's usually not inherent to the country. Civil war usually has origin from great power competition coming from the outside. One could even argue that the American Revolutionary War was significantly enabled by French support, and possibly wouldn't have been possible without French support against the British. He keeps winning these chess games over and over again against very different leaders. Now, you might think that he's completely powerless with regard to China, that Russia is completely dependent on China. However, I recommend you look at the long game. He is selling as much weaponry to India as he is to China. So all those advanced Russian fighters that they're selling off to China right now, where the Chinese build off their own knockoff versions, and the Russian rockets that the Chinese use to fly people into orbit. Of course, until this Saturday, Americans are also flying their people onto orbit on Russian rockets. They're also selling the same to India. And if you think about it, there's really no reason to expect India to be able to afford the same prices that China can. So why is that done? India has also been invited by Russia into some of these cooperative organizations that involve both Russia and China. What's happening is that Putin is, in the long term, trying to balance China with India. In this regard, he's way more agile than the US, even though the US should be in a vastly better, vastly stronger position to prop up India, to be, let's say, if we're generous to Modi, a democratic counterbalance to an authoritarian China, or if we're being realistic, the counterweight on the Asian continent, a country that has, in fact, a strong interest in making sure Southeast Asia is not permanently dominated by China. The ability to infer things about geopolitics, right? The ability to figure out what the right game to play in geopolitics is, that's kind of easy. The hard part is really implementing it. How do you get several unaccountable intelligence agencies, your military contractors, your own diplomats to play along? That's a significant challenge in coordination. Because of this, I think almost all great statesmen are live players. Now, not all great statesmen, great industrialists, great artists are, just because they're live players, also great founders. Here I want to introduce a distinction between a founder, a great founder in this sense, and a live player. Putin didn't create Russia, right? Nor did he create even the Russian state. Elon, I think, did obviously create SpaceX pretty straightforwardly. Depending on its success, he might well be remembered or might turn out to have been a great founder all along, or he might just be a founder, right? Merely creating a particular company is usually not enough. It really has to be civilization scale. If we colonize Mars and it's on SpaceX dime and on SpaceX rockets, then I very happily and easily give him a great founder title because he makes human civilization multiplanetary, right? If SpaceX is just a moderately successful US aerospace company, I think it's possibly a great achievement, but probably not quite worth this history-altering perspective of, okay, this person did advanced social engineering to alter the course of human history, right? I do think Elon aspires to it because SpaceX itself started as this effort to put a greenhouse on Mars. Yeah, a plant, like a potted plant on Mars. What could be more useless? Except it's not, right? It's art. He's in fact a misunderstood artist and was all along. He understands that the sight of life on another planet, Earth-based life, not little green men, but Earth-based life on another planet, changes ideology forever. Just as the photo of the Earth from the moon inspired the generation of environmentalists, gave rise to all sorts of organizations like, Whole Earth Catalog was boosted by it. One of my titles from the Long Now Foundation, in a way, the Long Now Foundation would have never happened without the Whole Earth Catalog and Stuart Brand's input. Elon was trying to do this in the 90s with Russia. And, he was trying to buy Russian ICBMs and Russian rockets, and the Russians weren't taking him seriously. It was a ludicrous proposal. So he said, I'll build my own, which seemed an even more ludicrous proposal, right? He is trying to get a colony of people on Mars to change our self-conception as a species. He certainly knows that 300 or 500 or 5,000 people on Mars are going to be economically irrelevant for the rest of our lives. None of us is going to see an economically important Mars. But, there's a place in the night sky where people live. It'll be something you can point at. And the expectation of how the future goes will be different. It won't anymore seem insane to propose, maybe going to mine asteroids. And also, the perspective of what's a planetary disaster and what kills all of us, that's going to change massively as well. The interesting thing about this is the social engineering is even evident in the way he approached promoting his own company, right? You could use a boring test weight satellite to test your rockets. But when he wanted to test the Falcon Heavy rocket, he used a sports car. And in that sports car was a dummy dressed in an astronaut suit. That astronaut suit looked very much like a Formula One uniform, the sort of like suit that the race car drivers had. He had that stunt planned out for years. It was probably one of the key considerations he had when the spacesuit was being designed. And in fact, it looks almost identical to the spacesuit the astronauts are going to be flying in this Saturday. How different is this from NASA style? These aren't like NASA's astronauts. These are Elon's astronauts, right? They're going to drive there in a Tesla. They're going to go up there on the rocket. They're probably going to even have a shot where they repeat some of the same dumb jokes as they had from the car, right? Like the music that was playing in the car, or the towel that was a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the social engineering of that I discuss in a piece that I wrote, how Elon Musk is making engineers cool again. By making the company's most visible stunts so obviously cater to the engineers inside of SpaceX, means that within SpaceX, the engineers, rather than the PR people, are listened to, because the PR people see that the engineers' tastes are the ones that matter, right? And basically, he has single-handedly made NASA cool again. NASA might not really like him. Why? Because he's basically bypassing massive amounts of jobs programs for them. But their entire budget is based on this kind of coolness and popularity, right? He's the one that's replacing 1999 NASA, CGI of people on Mars with cool looking rockets at Cape Canaveral, right? He's doing that, not NASA, not Boeing. The status of the nerds and the engineers mattering means that when there's an engineering meeting within SpaceX, the nerds aren't overruled or bypassed. This means that he still probably occasionally has to smack down a nerd because engineers have a problem where they want to build cool toys instead of building economically productive stuff. And he probably has his eye on the economics. But he doesn't have to deal with middle management the way you might at a different company. I think Google has, for example, messed this up. I think in Google, very slightly rebranded middle managers are the ones in charge. It's not the truly excellent programmers. And I think if you try to build something interesting, creative, culturally impactful, it's not clear this is good for your position within the company. Amazon is then, I could contrast it again, but I went really deeply into Elon because I wanted to show how an industrialist might not just through technology, but through social engineering, change a whole civilization. First off, reviving the cult of the engineer, having the engineers matter more than the middle managers, reviving the cult of the individual with a vision, and producing essentially a living artwork on Mars for the purpose of changing our perspective of who we are as a species. Just to say, the original picture from the moon did something like this. The next one on, say, a different example of a live player would be Eric Prince. Eric Prince is the founder of a company called Blackwater. It's been since renamed. It's a private military corporation. And you very quickly realize that he's like an individual that's managed to get away with feuding with the US government, right? Like after having a significant loss of a contract where there was some scandal, I think there was some substance to the scandal actually, of his mercenaries doing some shitty things in Iraq. He lost a big contract, lost a lot of money, and now just occasionally does mercenary gigs for the Chinese and the Saudis, just there in Africa, in Sudan, or wherever else. He's also quite public about his feud with the US government, and his personal ideology is Randian, right? It's a strange mix of Randianism and conservative Christianity, just taken really far and really seriously, much as you could see Elon Musk is taking an ideology of like old school 1950s science fiction way too seriously and way too far. And just as you might think of Vladimir Putin taking Russian patriotism and the idea that at all costs Russia must stay a great power much too far. Nearly all the live players have this in common. Their private ideologies are very weird. They are different from mass-consumed beliefs. Why? Because they see more than everyone else. The idea of spontaneous market-derived order certainly is not going to appeal that deeply to the Elons of the world. Maybe a sort of libertarian aesthetic of, well, the shareholders don't tell me what to do. I get to smoke weed on Joe Rogan if I want to. Maybe that appeals to him, right? And to Putin, the idea that there's an inevitable course of history that leads to Western, Atlantic, US dominance, international institutions, that's unthinkable. It's ludicrous. Now, even if it's true, right, and even if it's popular among Russia's technocratic elites, he in fact had a lot of difficulty hiring a Russian minister of finance who doesn't basically implicitly believe in the neoliberal future. Their ideologies are strange and unique, and some of these live players try to proselytize their ideologies, try to spread them. For some other live players, these ideologies are private beliefs. They don't try to spread them, they just act on them. So at this point, I'm gonna open up for some questions. Live players, to repeat, focus on their adaptability. Just because they're adaptive doesn't mean they create new institutions. Even if they create new institutions, unless they impact the level of a civilization, they're not great founders in the great founder theory approach. They have strange, unusual private ideologies. They jump industries easily, and often they reinvent themselves through the process. and they're deeply misunderstood by the public, which is why I think agency, human agency, is systemically discounted. Because if you're very intelligent, you try to hide your agency from the world. You don't want to provoke your adversaries, right? For a while, you want to be, you know, the close advisor to the mayor of St. Petersburg and then the president of Russia. You don't necessarily want to be president of Russia on day one. So opening this up for questions.
Great. And I'll just warm everybody up. So yeah, if you want to throw your question in the chat, and then I will just call on you and you can ask your question to Samo. So initially, Samo, so you're bringing up this idea of live players. Do you have a contrasting definition of like what a dead player would be?
Oh yeah. A dead player is anyone that's acting off a script. Now again, the script might be very adaptive, but it's only adaptive until it isn't. One way to think of this is that, you know, the British Colonial Office was largest in the 1960s, 1 year before its abolition, because it was no longer needed. So the Colonial Office had the most employees, the largest budget, when Britain had the fewest colonies. A different example might be a company like Ford Motors today, right? Ford, right? No one expects them to build a self-driving car. No one even expects them to build a good electric car. Heck, we barely expect them to still be building cars. We assume that China is building those, the old style ones. But, you know, on paper, the company still does okay. Different one might have been the airline industry. The airline industry had very thin margins, these massive bureaucratic machines trying to, you know, optimize every dollar out of passengers on these very thin margins that enabled air travel and economies at scale. I think most politicians, most CEOs right now are dead players. I really hesitate to name people who I think are clearly dead players because this could be seen as an attack rather than an observation. It's best to flatter and to damn by omission.
Yeah. All right, let's turn to the chat. So Rachel, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Samo. My question is...
Good to see you, Rachel.
You too, yeah. I love the new thing you're doing. My question is about engineers that are really creative, kind of like Elon Musk level, potential to be great founders, but they have these visions to build products that you just know you can't launch. Is there a specific way that you would recommend for fine-tuning them if they're talented enough to have the grand vision, if they continue to like want to produce things that aren't economically viable? How do you strategize that?
It's a very difficult question. I think it depends to a significant amount on the engineer. I think if you get a good sense for the engineer for what they find as a fun problem, and you kind of find the product, and then you talk to them about a fun problem they could solve that just happens to be technically very difficult and necessary for your product, I think that works super well. So you might actually need a team of a super talented engineer that solves a concrete, difficult problem, and a less talented engineer you just kind of direct in the right way. Another way is to try to educate the engineer about people. This is more difficult, but I actually think this is, you know, people know about the negative part of the relationship Steve Jobs had with his technical partner, but what they don't know is that the positive end of it was he would find all these ingenious ways to communicate things about people, right? There's this like very classic story of, well, you know, can you shave off time off of, you know, how long it takes for the machine to boot up? And the person says, you know, no, I can't do that. And they're like, well, if someone's life depended on it, could you do it? And he says, obviously, yes, I would try to do something. And then he comes back with a calculation of number of users, seconds saved,
That makes sense.
and it turned out to be something like 5 to 10 human lifetimes. And then the engineer
so come up
does
with
it.
like cool games or problems they can solve to get them to do specific tasks.
That connects them, because I think they're like a little bit disconnected, disembodied, right? They care about people.
Okay.
They just don't naively think about people first. They think about these systems first.
Got it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Cool.
Excellent. Jacob, is this a question that you want to bring forth or just an idea? I don't know. Thought it was a pretty good question, but I guess we'll move on. Jacob, if you want to ask it later, I'll just call on you later. Just let me know. Alan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So really interesting topic. Kind of been thinking about it a lot recently. My question is, you mentioned live players that are currently within the existing political establishment or structure, whether it's on a national scale or international scale. But there's also these live players that are kind of outside of it, whether they're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, these founders that have kind of these really wild ambitions and aspirations. And it seems like in the past few years, there's been kind of a meme of, Jeff Bezos taking over and kind of everyone's going to be living under either Amazon or Apple, that's going to be your citizenship rather than the United States or Russia. How do you see the next, 5, 10, 15 years playing out with the live players that are within the existing political structure and those outside of it, and the threat that it poses for those within it?
Well, I think our political structure right now is significantly bereft of live players, right? I think we have a lot of people that were very used to things behaving in the super predictable, super bureaucratic way. And they find it deeply upsetting when the bureaucracies either stop working or don't connect to the world. I think it's super telling, no matter who was the president, that the CDC and the FDA could not, in fact, adapt in an agile way to COVID, right? And I think that we, in fact, have systemically been selecting against live players getting an easy start on their career, right? If you alter someone's first 10 or 20 years, you really alter their entire life. The reason Caesar wept when he was 30 at the statue of Alexander was partially because, Caesar wasn't born king of Macedonia, the heir to the kingdom of Macedonia, the way Alexander was. So of course, Alexander, by the time he's 30, conquers the known world. And Caesar, he's, barely really started his political career, right? He has to play catch up. Now imagine you made it so much worse that you need to basically, for example, for your thoughts to be taken seriously, that you have to play 20 to 30 years of bureaucratic academic games where you only make sure that you say small things, easily defendable things. And if you ever say a big thing, you've stepped onto too many toes. This would just be soul crushing to anyone who's a real life player, right? Or if they could stand it, it would at the very least be 30 lost years or 20 or 10 lost years. And then once you get tenure, you're not safe anyway, right? Because there's such academic oversupply. I could apply the same logic that I just applied to academia to, say, the corporate career ladder or kind of the self-promotion game. All of this stuff has been really, really wrung out. And I'll link another article I wrote on this that you might enjoy called Annoyance or Armageddon, which I wrote a few months ago. And I made the unfortunate and unfortunately correct prediction that there would be tens of thousands of Americans dead by now. And, of course, I originally wrote hundreds of thousands, but was talked to tone it down, right? Tone down the prediction. It's still in about the right ballpark, 100,000 isn't too far away from a few tens of thousands. And in it, I advocate that you kind of have to give keys to the ignition to a weirdo every now and then. I'm going to give one that I don't necessarily agree with, Dominic Cummings, right? Dominic Cummings is a live player. And he has been absolutely hated by British media, right? And it's not an accident he's absolutely hated by British media. His job ad, if you read it, basically completely disregards what should be normal chains of promotion and just asks for the smart people to come and work with him. And of course, the whole British establishment is like, you can't just bypass our credentialing system. You can't just bypass our career tracks. And we'll see whether he wins or not in that regard. So I think in the US, it's almost hard to think of a young live player. In the US, politics has been an old people's game for so long that no matter who becomes president this year, it's going to be the oldest US president ever, right? And Congress has been getting older every year. And the top people in the civil service have been getting older. And the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and the board members have been getting older. So I think in the US, at least, there's very little openness there. I think it will eventually reopen, and I hope not catastrophically, right? Because if you have a super automated system, no live players in it, it runs for a long time. By the time a live player gets in, they might be like Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. They can only just turn the lights off and declare defeat. Cool. I hope I answered your question, Alan.
Great. Sean, would you like to ask a question?
Samo, how do we pronounce your last name, by the way? I've heard so many different forms.
It's Burja.
Burja? Cool. My question is about weirdness. Something connected for me when you said that all these live players have very weird private ideologies. I wonder if you can just unpack that a little bit. Is it just that by definition, normalcy within like a collapsing civilization is just anything that gets out of that is just going to be weird? I was wondering if you can unpack that.
Well, can I ask where do you think our sense of normal comes from? Who creates it? I think normalcy is constructed, right? So anyone outside the construct of normalcy is going to be weird by definition from their perspective of normalcy until they create a new normal. I think a very interesting thing to consider is there's what's her name? Let me just find her. Okay, Alexandra Albaikana. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. She's the creator of Sci-Hub. Has anyone here used Sci-Hub? I'm just going to say I obviously used it. You should pirate papers. Just destroy Elsevier, like scatter its ashes among the like fields to fertilize new science. It should just be destroyed. So do you know what her private ideology is? It's a mixture of, she literally has an essay titled Why Stalin is God. And you might think that, you know, she's kidding for a while until you realize that no, she means it quite literally. Let me see if I can find this essay. If someone else finds it first. There we go. Okay, I'll link it later. Let's see, what does she say? Ideas, no copyright, about, I'll find the link later. I'll find the link later. But she just writes this massive long essay in Russian. You have to put it through Google Translate. And turns out her beliefs about the world are derived from an idiosyncratic interpretation of neuroscience, where she wants all of humanity to together become one collective brain. And she sees all impediments to sharing information and knowledge as impeding that brain and global consciousness. And she also believes that Soviet communism and some religious communities were the closest we ever came to that in the past.
Wow.
So I think I should probably substantiate this as soon as I can, because it just sounds so insane. People might think I'm making it up, but reality is actually it's full of these kind of insanities that, you know, just don't fit our normal worldview, right? Like, who are the people that go out of their way to alter reality? I think it's people who don't fit into normal reality very well. And here is the essay. She doesn't make it easy to find. There we go. I would almost call this like esoteric Stalinism or something. You can translate parts of it and also go to her main site. It has amazing energy. It has big programmer energy. So there we are. Cool.
Thank you, Samo.
So weirdness, partially because our sense of normalcy is constructed, partially because the people are misfits. They were round and they were pressed into, you know, square pegs, and it just doesn't work out for them. Like Alexandra tried to make advances in neuroscience directly, but she couldn't, right? She had to pivot into linguistics if you read her biography. And her terminology is super weird and idiosyncratic, right? Like if we unpack what she means by God and what she means by what is Stalin's position at the head of the Communist Party, it probably would end up being something reasonable, right? Or not.
Awesome. Great. And I'm going to ask this question on behalf of Evelyn. By definition, are live players a pure category, or are live players and dead players like poles between which most people fall?
They're poles, but I think it's sort of, it's a bimodal distribution, and it's very heavily skewed towards dead players. So dead here means strategically dead. It doesn't mean physically dead. You can enjoy and live a very nice life, following scripts, following routines. It can be experientially rich. It's certainly valuable. But from a strategic perspective, imagine you're playing the equivalent of a video game or a multi-sided board game. And you look around the table and you see, okay, at that part of the table, there's no human. There's just a piece of paper with some basic instructions and if and then clauses. And there's only one or two other people sitting at the table. You know, that game only has 2 or 3 live players. And the live players, you know, they don't necessarily agree with each other. And I also believe it's possible to lose hope at one point in life. So it is possible to just become a dead player or awaken from being a dead player to becoming a live player. But prepare yourself for things becoming very strange if you do. Very quickly, consensus reality starts, it starts falling apart, right? So deeply bimodal distribution, it is a spectrum. I think stepping out of consensus is a strong attractor. I think stepping into consensus is a strong attractor, just psychologically, but also information theory wise, right? If you rely on normal channels of information, you become more normal over time, even if you're original at first. If you rely on abnormal channels of information, you become more distinct, more unusual.
Great, thank you. Coleman, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Hey, I like the concept, and I've definitely seen it in people where I feel like I can kind of predict their reaction to certain things. But my question is if there are any particular like impressive case studies of a live player like moves that you've found particularly inspiring or interesting.
I mean, there are lots of people. I think that if you, if you go read about Paul Kagame, I find him somewhat inspiring, right? Where he stabilized the country that had gone through genocide and achieved not just prosperity, but reconciliation between the Tutsi and the Hutu, right? So he's a contemporary live player. I think historical case studies, lots of them, I've done lots of them, and I'm afraid you're just gonna have to wait for more of the stuff to be released. My biggest bottleneck is always writing. I'm a slow, cautious writer, faster researcher, but had done case studies on historical life players such as Catherine the Great and Friedrich the Great, but also, also some really interesting people like, Rosa Luxemburg and so on, right? So I think you could choose biographies of many people. I think in the West, Churchill is popular to read about. I think that Lincoln is certainly acceptable, but ideally you read something about someone from a really different culture or from a really different environment. And ideally someone who is in as close a position as you might find yourself in. Hope that makes sense. Like,
Awesome, yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Great. Anjan, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I don't think I can ask it better than I wrote it, so I'm just going to read out my question. What unites otherwise very different live players? What's the underlying factor? Is it the outcomes they generate or the method in which they operate?
I think it's the method. I think the method is this, they display this adaptability, right? This adaptability to circumstance, where the circumstance isn't such as, oh, a new competitor has arisen. It's something like our industry is no longer relevant. Our industry has gone away, or there's been an economic crash, or hey, there's been a global pandemic. Our shipping is delayed for 6 months, right? Or I am delayed for 6 months. I'm stuck outside of the country. I really have to emphasize that, it's these outlier events that often reveal who's alive and who's a dead player, because you'll see which institutions are piloted by the live players, because those are the ones that are going to not only survive, but thrive under adversity, right? I really don't want to use the term anti-fragile here, so I'm just gonna say that I'm not gonna use that term, but that should drive the intuition of which circumstances reveal it. I think that their commonalities I would downplay. I think there's the weirdness. They're round in a square world, or they're square in a round world, but they don't have much agreement with each other. They do all without exception need a personal justification for acting to change the world. So if you're the Maid of Orleans, if you're Joan of Arc, you might believe that you've been chosen by God and you're just enacting God's will. If you are, Eric Prince, you might think that you are a Randian hero and that this is what you're doing with your life. And of course, it's morally correct for you to act. And then you reference back to all of this. If you're Vladimir Putin, you might think that it's your duty as the president of Russia and so on to like maintain a stable, independent country and safeguard the interests and the traditions of the Russian people, except you just actually believe it instead of it having been this kind of surface thing that you're supposed to believe. So there's a moral justification for action, because interestingly, I think people, if they believe it's not their place to act, they don't. Now, of course, just because a belief is there and just because it's strong enough that the person is a live player, it doesn't mean it's like objectively true, right? Or at least according to our value systems, it might not be, right? I certainly don't agree with everything with Xi Jinping, right? Or with Vladimir Putin. But I do think that they find those justifications very compelling.
Do you think it's almost necessary then? There's an element of delusion or irrationality?
Yeah, there is an element of delusion or irrationality, but I think this is the destiny of, I think, all of us, right? Like, we are incomplete minds. I think we're much more competent minds than we usually think we are. I moved over the years very much away from the rationalist conception of, human minds as inherently broken or like flawed or biased. I think that with self-examination and reflection, but not just self-examination, like work on difficult problems, I think human minds can become super, super impressive, super formidable. But I really want to point out here, though, that this irrationality that the live players do is mirrored by an irrationality of the dead players, who in fact believe that they don't have to act. They believe that they personally don't have to act. It's as much a cope on the inactive side as it is on the active side. Imagine one side has the button, the light is broken and it always shows green, and the other side has a broken light that always shows red. Both of them are disconnected from reality, and we disproportionately benefit from the few that have the broken green light.
If I could ask a follow-up as well. This is kind of a half-formed thought, but let's say this is a new concept for me and I've learned this from you. I wanted to ask a question about the kind of the actionability of this. Like, in some sense, is there a survival bias to being a live player? I always think of the example.
Oh yeah, massive.
Like, if you look at a private equity firm like TPG and you look at the guy who started it, it's like David Bonderman, like, was a lawyer doing Arabic stuff in the Middle East for 12 years and then was in Texas with some rancher, and it's just like so random. And you look at the number 2 guy at TPG and it's like Baker Scholar at Harvard, like partner at Goldman Sachs. It's just like a perfect resume. And you just think, if you ran that reality again, it's kind of improbable that that first guy maybe he would just be some random dude in the Middle East, but that second guy,
or maybe he would be a random dude in the Middle East, or maybe he'd become a Ukrainian politician, or maybe he'd been a Spanish novelist. I'm actually going to say something. If someone masters several careers to a high degree consequentially, like, that's super improbable, right? Say Arnold Schwarzenegger being both an extremely good bodybuilder and running for governor and succeeding. I bet if you reran history all over again from Arnold Schwarzenegger's birth, he might become president of Austria. He might become head of a technological entrepreneur. He might become a technological entrepreneur. He might become the head of a mercenary outfit, or he might become a Hollywood actor all over again, right? Meanwhile, I think that if you ran the universe where the person that, has the super nice sounding cookie cutter standard career, you rerun that person's career in a different world, I think they're still a very high grade careerist, but they ultimately are climbing ladders. They're not building ladders, right? They're climbing someone else's ladder. Someone else designed that career track for them. It's not objective, right? Harvard's not objective. The career tracks are not objective. They're arbitrary. At their very best, they can be the equivalent to the Roman cursus honorum, which is the sequence of posts you make people go through to show their worth. But the exact obstacle course is super arbitrary, right? And super contingent. Yeah. So that's what I would say, right? And note, when you rerun the universe, does that person really outcompete other people who are super similar? maybe that super standard cookie cutter career is also improbable. That person, to get at the end of the cookie cutter career, had to outcompete 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 people trying to do a cookie cutter career. The live player only needed to outcompete, 2, 3 people maybe.
So if I could paraphrase what I'm getting from you, this live player concept isn't necessarily only helpful as an analysis tool. It's potentially helpful also as like a personal action tool. It could give you extra confidence if you are different or weird.
With the caution that being live player can get you killed. like literally Soviet dissidents, right? They were live players, right? Or you might become a billionaire or something, and or you might end up being a writer who's recognized after your time and just live like a miserable life until that, right?
So what's the difference between being a live player and simply going for higher risk, higher reward? I mean, I always think of the Joe Heinrich thing, like tradition is smarter than you. Like most of the time when you question tradition, the base rate is you're going to be wrong. There is a lot of accumulated wisdom in tradition. So what's the difference there?
It's very difficult to describe from the inside, but it's super apparent that some people routinely outperform tradition. Well, I think what they actually do is they understand the reason the tradition was there in the first place. Chesterton Spence, right? The argument of Chesterton Spence applies for a fence that you don't know the purpose of. If you know exactly who and why put the fence there, then of course you can safely take it down when those circumstances are matched. And I think that, it's very difficult to get there. I think principles include original thought with openness to unusual information channels, involve developing some charisma while being kind of either asocial or mildly antisocial. Something's going wrong, because I think that connection is like heroin for people, right? They love being close to other individuals. And if it means smothering over awkward ideas to be so close to others, I think this is human nature that we do this. So this is, if you actually think I'm flipping the usual sheep thing on its head. Usually it's a claim that, humans are sheep, this is bad, they're just cowardly. I actually think it might be this desire to be so close to other minds so it's the love that causes people to be all the same. So I actually think it's probably coming from a positive, not from a negative impulse. Though fear can also be used to like tamp down variation. But I think most of the lack of variation that we see, this kind of clustering in human distributions, I think that's because of our desire for connection, essentially, right? People sometimes want to be great writers because they want to be closer in spirit to the writer that greatly inspired them, right? So it can be also an inspiration to be an outlier. So if I have something, it's like, develop deep empathy that doesn't overlook flaws to these unusual, exceptional people. And perhaps, even if you don't want to be one, consider helping one or finding one, right? The self-interested Randian angle on this might be, you don't have to take all the risks. You can just help someone else's risk, have a better risk reward payoff, have their payoff curve be slightly higher, and take your share. The equivalent of VC of humans or something. Though, God, please let's not coin that as a term for Twitter bios, God.
Awesome. So let's go back to the chat here. Thank you, Anjan. Those were great questions. I want to do Tyson's question because it's really fun. So Tyson, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Raven.
Sorry, I don't think I'm hearing you.
Yeah, you're muted.
Thank you so much. My bad. All right. My question is, what are some strange, outlandish, or eccentric skills that live players of the future are starting to learn and study today?
Well, the crucial thing here is that I think it's going to be very different. I think one of the things that's probably happening right now is that people who have reinvented, by accident at least, the scientific method, that is, people who know how to set up theories and set up experiments on the basis of theories, they have a strong advantage right now because our society is overloaded with scientism and essentially fake science. but it's fake science with the Harvard degree attached to it, so you can't call it fake. There's like, I think it's pretty much damning, for example, the use of statistics in medicine, right? Or the recent replication crisis. We are, as a society, cargo culting formal methods on a truly massive scale, because we demanded that there be a massive expansion of scientists after the Sputnik moment, right? The launch of Sputnik in the 1950s. And much as the Soviet shoe manufacturer that is given insufficient leather by the central planned economy, but told to make 20,000 pairs of shoes, they make tiny, tiny shoes that are useless because on paper they fill the quota. I think we've made tiny, tiny PhDs to fill the quota that allows us to claim that we're a thriving scientific society, right? So I think real science, when you can do it, very powerful, very important, done by very few people. The second thing is capitalism, actually doing capitalism, super rare, very important. This is kind of like Peter Thiel writes a lot about this. I think he's completely right. I also think doing Marxism for real, actually, no one's really done societal analysis plus trying to organize political parties that have as their key objective building new states. Like, when's the last political party you remember that's dedicated to like creating a new socioeconomic order? People were so invested in the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were the equivalent of like a high IQ cult when they were founded, right? That's why it was so enticing. Not only do you get to hang out with your friends and read the same books your friends have been reading, you get to participate in the betterment of all of society. And that was super appealing to people who are sometimes already very well off, were not themselves proletariat. And again, like, I don't think the Bolshevik Revolution made the world better. Though I certainly think Vladimir Lenin is like clearly a great founder type character because he invented the party, the political revolutionary party and the party state. And today we see in China like a live descendant of that model. So I do think that's a big change to society. So another one is the ability to read, by which I mean the ability to read things slowly and read things between the lines and try to extract deep meaning from text. And even at the best of times, I think this level of literacy was never reached by more than 5% of the population. But I think in the last 40 to 50 years, something has happened where even the 5% is like vastly too many. I think right now it's like maybe like 0.5% or 1%. It might have been the rise of visual culture, right? That might have been the reason. Or it might have been the attention scrambling effects of massively, drugging up most of the population and, use of the internet. I don't really know. I do know for a fact that people had higher reading comprehension. And because people now have lower reading comprehension, the writing has gotten worse. Compare a scientific paper in the most complex field you can find from 1925 to a modern scientific paper in the most trivial field you can find. The 1925 paper will be more intelligible and understandable because it's written for a person, right? The modern scientific paper is usually written for a committee. So it's trying to be defensive. It's trying to be small. It's not trying to convey. It's not expecting there's a mind on the other end that's doing it. It's expecting to be evaluated as homework. The difference between homework and research on a deep, deep level is unclear, right? So I don't mean to be picking on academia. Obviously, I think there's great work that sometimes happens in corners of academia, but I'm trying to convey that there's something deeply wrong with the way we read, and it's very difficult to convey. So maybe that's intellectual dark matter, reading, but for real. Because believe me, if you read books for real and you act on them, you get very weird very quickly. I hope that was a good answer to your question.
Yeah, really good. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we're really winding down here. I don't know if we have time for, well, Jacob has a question that is about success. Jacob, do you want to ask your question and maybe we could squeeze it in the last few minutes?
Sure. Sorry I didn't answer your last call to speak. Apologize for that. So I guess my intuition is that we're putting the cart before the horse. Like, that we have to have some sort of relatively comprehensive, unified definition of success, right? Because, for example, like speaking of outlandish, I actually don't think that Elon Musk is a live player. I actually don't think he's successful by my standards. You know, that's outlandish, obviously, but that's just a case in point of, don't we have to first agree on what
it's not
success
outlandish.
is? Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying successful, right? I'm just saying they go off script. And by successful, I mean they achieve what they set out to achieve, right? Note that for live players, I listed people with whose objectives I disagree. So it's not like I think there's an objective single measure. I think there are multiple possible agendas people could be pursuing. And what is looked at here is like this kind of really outlier human skill and outlier human impact. So if that feels more accurate, and I think it probably is, we can say outlier impact, outlier human skill, rather than success. Like, it's very happy to substitute those words to avoid that snag.
Great. And with that, I think we'll have to wrap up here. Thank you so much, Samo. And I'm so glad that you're going to keep coming because there's so much rich material here.
Thank you for having me. And I really want to say thank you to the audience. These were great questions. I enjoyed answering them. And also, I hope people can tell this is not scripted. I was just trying my best to live answer the questions. And sometimes, you know, the reality of things, how simple things are, can seem outlandish. So hope everyone has a good evening.
Great. And so I'll just do a little bit of a shout out for the events that we have coming up tomorrow. Benita Roy is doing an event in the morning. This is one of our Wisdom Gym events, so check that out. We also have Earth Regeneration with Joe Brewer. Joe is really doing this amazing work doing ecosystem regeneration and restoration and creating all of these different institutions. He's a live player for sure, so come and hear him talk. I think it'll be really interesting. That'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then I will be hosting Socratic Speed Dating, the Ask Hole edition. So we'll be playing Ask Hole again this week, which is a social boundary pushing game. And that'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And Tyson, do you want to talk about your event as well?
Sure. Thank you, Raven. The event is called Flowing with Unknowingness. And so we explore deepening our relationship with uncertainty through creative self-expression. And the cherry on top is accessing group flow state, that experience where I feel that we are each instruments to the same song, and seeing how well we can tap into that sweet space. And yeah, we practice freestyle rap and spoken word, exploring language and creative expression. And that is Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. And I look forward to seeing some of you there. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. And then just to close off, the Stoa is a gift that we want to give for everyone at this time of need. And if you would like to give us a gift in return, you can visit the Stoa at the Gift Economy. And with that, thank you everyone and have a wonderful evening.